Thank you. Just getting a timer going. It's really delightful to be with y'all today. It's a little bit late here. I'm joining you from Australia. I'm not obviously perhaps due from my accent from Australia, but I'm here today to share with you some of the research that we've been doing on the Women in STEM Ambassador team. Next slide, please. Before I get into it, the full credit is due to the entire research team, including our fantastic project lead, Isabel Kingsley. We had a number of research assistants, as well as Professor Lisa Harvey-Smith, who is the Australian government's Women in STEM Ambassador. So by way of introduction, that's a government initiative that's been in place since 2018 to increase the participation of girls and women in STEM disciplines and careers. As part of that initiative, which is funded by government grants, which is, I'm the chief investigator on those grants, we've been conducting a series of research studies to try and shed light on where inequities might exist and what mechanisms might be put in place to redress them. So this is one part of our research portfolio. So to set the scene, next slide. The value of anonymization, oh, I've forgotten I have animations here. You can go ahead and make the two images appear, sorry. The value of anonymization is pretty clear. Most of us are aware of kind of the famous study where existing longstanding gender biases in orchestra auditions were suddenly vanished when the auditioners were blinded, or the evaluators were blinded. And of course, to this audience, it's no surprise that anonymization stands as kind of one of the hallmarks of the peer review process, often for publication or for funding applications or research applications, which is what we're talking about today. Next slide, and probably a couple clicks. So the value of anonymization, whether that's single or blind anonymous peer review, has been tested as one mechanism to get rid of documented barriers to equity in STEM. So this has been looked at in terms of researcher gender, researcher ethnicity, has been documented in the area of scientific publications, as well as, quite famously, reducing or actually eliminating gender biases in access to Hubble Space Telescope time. So in the context of this, it seems like perhaps anonymization could be kind of the magic trick. Like, let's sort out how to do that for funding or resource applications. Could this be the winner? We came into this research understanding that most of the research had been done in the US. So being in Australia, which is a slightly different research ecosystem, like the UK, it's relatively smaller. Folks are a little bit more well-known. And we had the opportunity to ask for research organizations to join us. Next slide, please. To join us to trial anonymizing applications for access to scientific equipment. So these 4 organizations run schemes to grant researchers from their own organizations and from external to their organizations for access to telescope time, computing time, and the like. The 4 organizations signed up to share their data with us from prior to anonymization and post-anonymization. Can I get 2 clicks, please? So 3 of the organizations, to anonymize them, required applicants to exclude their names and affiliations in the application text, to use third-person language, and to provide more identifying information in a separate document, which was available to evaluators, but the evaluators weren't compelled to look at that. One organization decided to apply what we're calling semi-anonymization. They allowed the applicants to use first initials and surnames, removing affiliations and shifting that list to the end of the application. So kind of deprioritizing what might be a default where applicant information appears first. So we have some variability already, you can see in the study design setting this up. Next slide, please. So we got access, a couple more clicks, sorry. One more. We had access to pre and post data on application scores, success rates, and how the resources were allocated. And we wanted to see if there were existing inequities prior to anonymization and then what the effect of anonymization was. So I'm going to go through our 3 outcomes one at a time. The first is career seniority. So what we found is that in the 2 organizations that provided career seniority data, there were no differences in the 3 outcomes. So scores, success rates, or resource allocation. One more click, please. But what we did find, importantly, is that anonymization significantly boosted success rates for early career researchers at one of those 2 organizations. And you can see here the effect is pretty striking. So the equity beforehand could have perhaps been shading some biases against early career researchers. And once that career stage information was not available to evaluators, we see a sudden increase in the success rates amongst those applicants. In terms of gender, what we found were, again, no significant differences according to gender in the 3 outcomes prior to anonymization. You can flash up the figure for that. So of course, success rates and scoring patterns differed across the 4 organizations, but you can eyeball here, and we did all the modeling to test whether these are different across gender and found no evidence for that. In terms of, next slide, please. So that was before anonymization. Now, after anonymization, what we found is that the existing gender equity in scores and resources was maintained. So that's a good sign. We didn't introduce systematic biases in terms of gender for these 2 outcomes. And for the 3rd outcome, next slide, anonymization elevated success rates at 1 of the 4 organizations. So I wouldn't put all my eggs in that one basket, but there is some evidence of shifting outcomes for genders according to anonymization. But again, this was in one of the 4 organizations. So I will offer some conclusions and implications quickly. I'm out of time. So first, I guess what these findings point to is that anonymization can serve as a mechanism to improve peer review. So especially looking at that early career data, what looked like equity at the beginning, kind of anonymization uncovered that might actually be a pattern of inequity that anonymization can resolve. That this process can have value, especially when implemented with care when and where needed. And that's perhaps the biggest punchline here, which is perhaps to go in with anonymization where there is evidence of inequity that could be solved. So I don't think personally that anonymization is a panacea, but it can certainly help in situations where there are documented inequities. One more slide, please. So what we also want to emphasize here, and this is echoing some of what Stephanie was saying, is that evaluation is really essential. So we're obviously sharing the findings of this research. We need to know more about when and where anonymization works to help shift the dial towards equity in the in research, kind of in the research ecosystem, and that we need to, as the Women in STEM ambassador, our data were limited to men and women. We need to know a lot more about the full spectrum of gender, as well as other aspects of identity. As Ken mentioned, things like ethnicity are equally as important. So I'll just flip out this last slide. We have a preprint, which is under peer review at the moment, and also a research brief that you can check out these results in more detail, and of course, reach out via all the places. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was very insightful, and I have to say I've had a look at the report beforehand, but it was it was much more accessible the way you presented the information just out of in these 7 minutes than me trying to read it in the same amount of time. So that was very helpful. Thank you very much.
It's a dense approach.
Thank you. So we've got a few questions, and naturally, because people had a bit more time to think about it, there's a few more questions for Ken, but there's also some for you, Lisa. So I'll start with those that have trying to be democratic about it, that have received most votes, as there seems to be most interest. So there's quite a few that have received 3 votes. So I'll just start with 2 for you, Ken, and then I'll have 1 for Lisa. So the first one we have for you is by Rachel. Thank you, Ken, for your presentation. Is there any bias in the 60% who meet the thresholds to enter the lottery if there's no anonymization at that point?
Well, what we've been doing is looking at the characteristics of the people who do, pass the threshold and reach the be successful in being awarded. And as I briefly alluded to, we have seen that the gender diversity, which was already good in before we introduced the randomization, has been maintained, and that was what the modelling we did beforehand had suggested. But we've also seen that the diversity of institution has improved. The diversity of ethnic origin has also, ethnic background has also improved. It's interesting because I think one of the other questions I've noticed is essentially turning it the other way about, as it were, of the people who don't pass the threshold, and we haven't, understandably perhaps, haven't gone and looked explicitly so far at the people who don't pass the threshold and whether there are common characteristics among them. It's an interesting point that will be worth investigating further with the consultants we're working on that. But that's what they're especially looking at in this immediate evaluation stage, which is the characteristics of the pool as a whole, as it were. Because obviously the outcomes from the awards, because I didn't mention that they're at 2-year awards, the outcomes at the end are going to take a little bit longer to see.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So there's another one that received 4 likes, so to say. So how much extra administration and time does it take to perform the partial randomization, for example, for the funder and for reviewers?
It's actually exactly the opposite. There's a lot less administration and a lot less time. In the past, once we got all of the initial assessment, then the final decisions took quite a month or so to be able to sort out, get confirmation of rank orders, panel meetings, all the rest of it to take place. All of that's been done away with. And the randomization itself, which is done completely independently from us by consultants we employed to work on it, it literally takes about half an hour, and whatever we send off the anonymized references of these are the people who've passed the threshold, and they send us the results the next day. Basically, it's a very, very swift process that removes a lot of administration. The other advantage is it also gives us a completely ranked, ordered list from beginning to end, as it were, and we can draw the threshold to be funded at the appropriate place, depending on the amount of money we have available. So we will always have reserves. As I say, there are always far more people who are suitable for funding than we have the money to be able to support. But if we do then get more money that enables us to offer more awards, we know exactly who to go to next, because it's a completely rank ordered list.
Thank you. Okay, I've got 2 questions for Lisa, and then a few more for Ken as well. So first one, Lisa, you said that you don't think that anonymization is the solution in all cases. What could be the problems of anonymization? Thank you.
It's a good question. I think it actually loops a little bit to the efforts involved in anonymization. So it certainly shifts the way applicants apply. So the way that it was done in these 4 organizations is not a resource neutral effort. And the organizations took great care. They did provide evaluators with some instructions about how to approach anonymization, like don't go and hunt down information on who the applicants are. So you kind of have to trust that your evaluators aren't doing that. And I'm sure this might come up again later in today's seminar. But I also think there are cases where, so in Australia, in our other funding systems as elsewhere, there are schemes that run more like fellowships than project-based allocations. And obviously you can't anonymize if you are awarding a fellowship to someone for what they've done to date. So I think anonymization can be one piece of the puzzle to try and promote equity in a funding or resource allocation ecosystem, but it has its challenges. And I will, as I mentioned, also Australia is pretty small. So I personally know most of the people. When I'm asked to review grants, I already know who they are. And if they stripped out the name, I would probably still know who they are because we're a small enough country where the area of research that we're evaluating grants is identifiable. So you have to be a little bit careful by maybe believing that stripping names achieves anonymization. I think that's a real functional question to ask, whether that's feasible, and people can be not necessarily trying to find out who's writing an application, but they simply know, and then it's even harder. I'm a social psychologist, so once you have information in mind, it's really hard to ignore it.
Thank you, Lisa. I think from our review for the evidence review, that was also the main argument against implementing this systematically, as people within the sector tend to know each other. There's one more question here. So question for Lisa. Interesting data. Anonymization would also be removing contextual background of an applicant, for example, early career, who would have a less prolific track record, etc. Has your research looked into this as well?
That's an interesting question. So if you're stripping, I guess it depends on how you do it. So these organizations stripped identities, not necessarily track records, but there is a different approach to kind of 2-stage grant review where a project is evaluated first before any information about the researchers is made available to evaluators. I'm personally more a fan of that approach because I feel like you can get a fairly identity-free evaluation of the idea that's being presented, and then can layer in evaluation of maybe feasibility or, if you will, track record as evidence of being able to carry out that specific project. I think that there are cases where some researchers would say, I certainly want my prolific track record to be taken into account. Like, I actually don't want to be anonymized. I've worked really hard over the 5 years, and I don't want that stripped of me. And I think that there are cases in which that's a valid approach. If the allocation is dependent on some sort of feasibility or achievement evaluation. But if you go to the British Academy model of randomization, then that doesn't really have any bearing whatsoever. So it's probably a middle ground for me. It's a middle ground and probably a combination of methods that is the best approach depending on the type of allocation you're trying to do.
Thank you for a comprehensive answer, Lisa. We've got time for, I think, 2 more questions for Ken. So again, I'll go for the ones that have been voted up the most. So there's one here asking, how were candidates made aware of the British Academy partial randomization? How do we know that the applicants were influenced by the new policy?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. We've done a lot of work on our communications about this with our communications directorate and colleagues, both through social media, through the email bulletins that we send out. The British Academy, also members of my team also we go regularly to universities to raise awareness about the Academy's funding as a whole. And we tend to go to places that, you know, might not necessarily think of where we get the largest numbers of applications. We want to make sure that people are aware of. So yeah, we do a lot of promotion about that. When the number of applications was started increasing, the first round of randomisation, we wondered if that was partly at least more to do with opening up again of travel and fieldwork possibilities after the pandemic. That was certainly something. But the fact that the numbers have continued to increase and the responses we've tended to see suggest that it is people being encouraged to apply who might otherwise have self-disqualified themselves. That it's not the only reason, it won't be the only reason why people have become aware of it, but we definitely think that's been part of it.
Thank you. And one last question, because before we move on to the next set of presentations, have you received pushback, Ken? For example, is there any feedback from people who are not successful in the randomization, feeling that the quality of the application was not sufficiently considered? And
yeah.
if so, how do you respond and make the case for randomization?
No, it's a good point. Yeah, we haven't really had significant pushback from people. Many people value the fact that they can now get feedback, which we previously weren't able to give. Many people, we're aware, use the fact that if they're told they passed the quality threshold but were then unsuccessful, that is in some way a kite mark of endorsement of their project anyway, that they're actually able to then say, you know, the idea was great, it just didn't happen to get, and we're talking about very small scale funding in the first place. The other thing, again, I noticed in one of the other questions in the Q&A that somebody had said about, can they reapply? Yes, people who are unsuccessful, having had the feedback about whichever characteristic it was, that whichever criterion, I beg your pardon, was not being considered as strong, particularly if it's the methodology, for example, or the timescale, if the quality of the research or whatever, they're able to address that aspect of it more and be able to resubmit. Hopefully a better application a second time. And we are seeing people who are successful subsequently who have been turned down at the randomization stage, as well as people who've improved from having had a no answer to begin with to then getting yes across the board and being above the threshold and getting the award. So, you know, we think it's fairly positive. There are always going to be the odd one or two people who I don't understand why, you know, but not given the proportion, the numbers of the 1,800 I'm talking about that we're getting. It's a tiny proportion, and they tend to be, you know, not sufficiently upset to, you know, not be persuadable. The fact they can reapply.